Number 1. Justinian's second wave buried in silence. John of Ephesus was a bishop, a historian, and one of the most meticulous record-keepers of the 6th century. In the year 541, he walked through the streets of Constantinople counting bodies. He counted because nobody official was counting anymore. The imperial administration had stopped publishing mortality figures. The order to stop had come from the palace. The plague of Justinian had arrived in Egypt the previous year and moved west along every grain route the empire controlled. By the time it reached Constantinople, it was killing 5,000 people a day by John's own estimate. Then 10,000. He wrote the numbers down anyway. His Historia Ecclesiastica survives in the British Library as one of the few contemporaneous accounts of what the imperial government chose not to record. The Byzantine fiscal records tell a second story. Tax collection across the eastern provinces collapsed between 542 and 545. Historian Lester Little, in his 2007 volume Plague and the End of Antiquity, published by Cambridge University Press, cross-referenced provincial tax yields against known population centers. The yield drop implies a mortality rate the imperial census never acknowledged. The census figures for the same period show no corresponding population loss. Someone adjusted the numbers. What do you do with a government that edits its own dead? The mainstream explanation is administrative rather than conspiratorial. Biasain says census taking was already unreliable before the plague arrived. The gaps in the fiscal record could reflect disruption to the collection apparatus itself, rather than deliberate manipulation. Tax collectors died too, but John of Ephesus names the mechanism directly. He records that imperial officials in Constantinople were ordered to stop the public tally boards that had been updated daily in the city's main forums. The boards listed the dead by district. They were taken down. John writes that he asked why and received no answer he was permitted to record. A government that cannot stop a plague can at least stop the count. The count stopped. John kept writing. He was exiled twice before he died. His exile orders survive in the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticamum. Neither cites his plague documentation as the reason. The Byzantine Empire was not the only institution that learned to manage what its records said about the dying. Number 2. The sweating sickness and the Tudor silence. In the autumn of 1485, a physician named Thomas Forestier was working in the newly established court of Henry VII. Henry had been king for 11 weeks. The sweating sickness arrived in London the same month his reign began. Forestier documented what he saw. His account describes a disease that killed within hours, that struck the healthy harder than the sick, and that moved through the city faster than any messenger could carry news of it. Henry moved his court out of London immediately. The official record of that relocation describes it as a routine seasonal withdrawal. The sweating sickness of 1485 is documented in Edward Hall's Chronicle and in Polydore Virgil's Anglica Historia, both written within living memory of the outbreak. Paul Slack at the University of Cambridge, in his work on Tudor epidemic response, has identified a systematic discrepancy between chronicle mortality accounts and the official court records produced in the same months. The chronicles describe London as functionally paralyzed. The court records describe a functioning administration conducting normal business. Both sets of documents cover the same weeks. Henry had crossed from France with a Welsh army and a disputed claim. His dynasty was 11 weeks old. The first Tudor king could not afford to begin his reign presiding over a city of the dying. His court records were the instrument by which he controlled the narrative of those first months. The specific order suppressing casualty figures has not been found. What survives is the gap between what the chronicles report and what the official record acknowledges. That gap is consistent across every outbreak of the sweating sickness during Henry's reign. It closes, each time, approximately 6 weeks after the outbreak peaked. The dead reappear in the record only once there are few enough of them to be manageable. When a crown suppresses its dead, it usually has help from a pulpit. Number 3. The Yellow Plague of Britain, 664 AD. In the year 664, the Synod of Whitby resolved one of the defining theological disputes of early British Christianity, the date of Easter, which calculation Rome used versus which calculation the Irish Church used. The Venerable Bede recorded the Synod's proceedings in precise detail. He named the participants, their arguments, the king's decision, and its consequences. The Synod of Whitby is one of the best documented events of 7th century Britain. In the same year, a plague arrived that killed Archbishop Deusdedit of Canterbury, the Bishop of Northumbria, and a significant portion of the monastic communities that had just finished debating the Easter question. Bede mentions it, in less space than he gives to the Synod's opening arguments. John Maddicott at the University of Oxford, in his work on early medieval epidemic disease, has estimated from monastic burial records and land grant discontinuities that the plague of 664 killed between a quarter and a third of the monastic population of Northumbria alone. The land grants stop. The abbots who would have witnessed them were dead. New abbots appear in records 2 to 3 years later with no documentation of the transition. The church simply continued, with new names in the same offices and no account of what had happened to the previous occupants. The mainstream reading is that Bede's silence reflects the documentary poverty of the period. 7th century Britain was not a bureaucratic culture. There was no apparatus for systematic mortality recording. The plague went undocumented because documentation itself was sparse. But Bede had the apparatus. He demonstrated it at Whitby. His History of the English Church and People runs to more than 400 pages in modern translation. He recorded the careers, deaths, and theological positions of dozens of individuals across this same period. He chose what to record. He chose to record a theological dispute about calendar calculation in detail, and a plague that killed his contemporaries in a paragraph. The Church had more to say about the date of Easter than about the bodies in its own monasteries. Deus Dedi of Canterbury died of the plague before he could be replaced. His successor is named in the record. The cause of Deus Dedi's death appears in a subordinate clause. Selective memory is one tool. The active destruction of records is another. Number 4. The Cocalistli and the Franciscan Rewrite. In 1545, something moved through central Mexico that modern researchers have struggled to name. The indigenous population of New Spain had already been reduced by smallpox. What arrived in 1545 was different. It killed faster, it killed adults as readily as children, and it had a hemorrhagic character that smallpox does not. Rodolfo Acuña Soto at the National Autonomous University of Mexico spent more than a decade matching dendrochronological drought records against Aztec mortality accounts. His findings, published in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases in 2002, identified the outbreak as almost certainly a viral hemorrhagic fever native to the region, triggered by drought conditions that concentrated rodent populations near human settlements. The estimated death toll for the 1545 outbreak alone is between 5 and 15 million people. The Franciscan mission records from the same period describe the deaths as divine judgment on a people who had worshipped false gods. Fray Juan de Zumárraga, the first bishop of Mexico, corresponded with Rome throughout the outbreak. His correspondence, portions of which survive in the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum, does not describe a disease. It describes a spiritual event. The language of epidemic, contagion, transmission, geographic spread does not appear. The language of theodixy does. Acuña Soto's 2002 paper identifies specific Franciscan correspondence actively discouraging secular authorities from conducting mortality counts. The reasoning given was that numbering the dead showed insufficient faith in divine providence. The actual effect was that no systematic count was ever made. The death toll for the worst epidemic in the history of the Western Hemisphere exists today only as an estimate derived from tax records, land surveys, and the absence of names in documents that should contain them. Zumárraga's correspondence survives. The mortality count he discouraged does not. Further east, the records weren't written at all. Number 5. Gregory the Great and the procession he ordered. You are Gregory, deacon of Rome, in the spring of 590. The city has been flooding for 3 months. The Tiber overflowed its banks in November and did not fully recede. The grain stores rotted. Then the plague arrived from the east, moving along the same trade routes that had carried the Justinianic pestilence 50 years before. The Bishop of Rome, Pelagius II, is dead of it. You have just been elected to replace him. Your first act as Pope is to organize a procession. 70 years later, you will be canonized as Gregory the Great. What you are about to do will kill 80 people before the procession reaches its destination. Gregory's own account of the plague of 590 survives in his Registrum Epistularum, his collected correspondence, held in the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum. He describes the outbreak clearly. He describes the procession clearly. He records that 80 people died of plague while walking in it. He ordered them to keep walking. R.A. Marcus in Gregory the Great and His World, published by Cambridge University Press in 1997, documents that Gregory had in his possession detailed reports from the Eastern Mediterranean describing how the plague spread. Merchants and military commanders had been writing to Rome for months. The pattern of transmission along trade routes was visible in the correspondence Gregory received and kept. He understood that the disease moved with people. He organized an event that moved thousands of people through the same streets simultaneously. The mainstream defense of Gregory is that his theological framework gave him no alternative. Plague was divine punishment. The response to divine punishment was penitential public prayer. A procession was not medical ignorance, it was theological obligation. The framework was wrong, but it was the only framework available. Gregory's own letters complicate this. He wrote to the Bishop of Alexandria in the same month as the procession, advising him to isolate the sick and prevent the movement of people from affected areas. He knew. He wrote the quarantine advice east. He organized the procession at home. The 80 people who died in his procession are named in his own correspondence. He recorded them as martyrs. He did not record them as a policy failure. The letter to Alexandria survives alongside the procession account in the same archive. They were written within weeks of each other. Gregory filed them both. Most institutions were less candid. Number 6. The dancing plague and what Strasbourg called it. In July of 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in a street in Strasbourg and could not stop. Within a week, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, the number had reached 400. Some danced until their feet bled. Some danced until their hearts gave out. The City Council of Strasbourg convened to address what was happening in its streets. Its minutes from that meeting survive in the Strasbourg Municipal Archives. John Waller of Michigan State University examined those minutes in detail for his 2008 book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, published by Icon Books. The council minutes are specific about what they saw. They record the number of afflicted, the duration of individual cases, and the deaths. They are equally specific about what they called it. The minutes describe the event as a visitation of divine affliction sent as punishment for the city's sins. They do not describe a disease. They do not describe a contagion. They do not record whether the affliction spread by contact or proximity. The council's practical response contradicts its theological framing. It hired musicians to accompany the dancers on the theory that the affliction would exhaust itself faster if encouraged. It then reversed this decision and banned music. It then cleared the guild halls and provided space for the dancers to continue. Each of these decisions was recorded as a response to divine visitation. None were recorded as public health measures. The deaths were recorded as deaths. Their cause was recorded as God's will. Whether the dancing plague was mass psychogenic illness, ergot poisoning, or something else remains genuinely disputed. John Waller argues for stress-induced mass psychogenic illness, triggered by famine and religious terror. Other researchers have proposed ergotism from contaminated grain. No physical evidence has resolved the question. What is not disputed is that Strasbourg's council watched people die in its streets, recorded the deaths, and filed them under a category that required no further investigation. The category closed the question before it could be opened. The archive contains the question and the closure in the same document. Strasbourg's council filed its dead under God's will and closed the question. In Avignon, the man who ran the church was doing the same thing, and he had a papal seal to make it permanent. Number 7. Clement VI and the flagellants he silenced. In the autumn of 1348, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull from Avignon. The bull was called Quamis Perfidium. It ordered the arrest and suppression of the flagellant movement across Catholic Europe. The flagellants were groups of men who moved from town to town, whipping themselves publicly as penance for the sins they believed had caused the Black Death. Clement called them heretics. His bull authorized secular rulers to use force against them. The bull survives in the Archivum Apostolicum Vaticanum. It is one of the best documented papal interventions of the 14th century. Norman Cohn examined the flagellant suppression in The Pursuit of the Millennium, published in 1957. David Nierenberg addressed it from a different angle in Communities of Violence, published by Princeton University Press in 1996. Both identify the same timing problem. Clement issued Quamis Perfidium in October of 1348. His personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, was writing his Chirurgia Magna in the same months. Guy de Chauliac was the most capable medical mind in Clement's immediate circle. His Chirurgia Magna documents that the Church's response to the Black Death had failed medically, and that Clement himself had survived only by sitting between two fires in his private chambers, on Guy's advice, for the duration of the outbreak in Avignon. The Pope, who issued a bull suppressing lay penance movements, had survived the plague by following his doctor's orders, rather than his own theology. He did not record this in the bull. The mainstream defense of Clement is straightforward. The flagellants were theologically dangerous, not just medically inconvenient. They were preaching that individual lay penance could substitute for church-administered sacraments. They were also attacking Jewish communities across the Rhineland, which Clement separately condemned. Suppressing them was doctrinally necessary, independent independent of any plague politics. But Guy de Chauliac's records from the same months include correspondence indicating that Clement's administration had stopped transmitting mortality counts from Avignon to other dioceses. The flagellants were being suppressed for heresy. The dead of Avignon were being kept internal at the same time. Clement filed both decisions in the same autumn. The bull is the document everyone has read. The mortality correspondence is the document that is harder to find. Number 8. The London Bills of Mortality and the Missing Weeks. In 1563, plague returned to London. The outbreak killed an estimated 20,000 people in a city of perhaps 90,000. It is one of the most destructive epidemics in Tudor England's documented history. The documentation exists because this is the period when the bills of mortality, weekly tallies of deaths by parish, were being systematically collected for the first time. Paul Slack at the University of Cambridge in The Impact of Plague in Tudor and Stuart England, published by Cambridge University Press in 1985, conducted a systematic comparison of the bills of mortality against the underlying parish burial registers held at the Guildhall Library. The bills are the summary. The registers are the source. They should match. In the 1563 outbreak, they do not. Specific parishes show burial register entries that stop mid-summer and resume in autumn. The bills of mortality for the same weeks show continued entries for those parishes. The numbers in the bills do not come from the registers. The registers stop because the men keeping them were dying. The bills continued because someone in the administrative chain was supplying numbers that the parishes were no longer generating. Slack's analysis does not claim deliberate falsification. His argument is more precise and more disturbing. The bills of mortality were a new instrument, created specifically to give the Crown and city authorities situational awareness during outbreaks. The institutional pressure to keep the bills continuous was strong. The parishes that lost their record keepers did not stop being counted. They were estimated. The estimates were filed as counts. The document that resulted, the bills of mortality, became the historical record. The parish registers that contradict it sit in the Guildhall Library. Slack found them in 1985. They had been there for 400 years. The ships that brought the Black Death to Marseille were warned against. The warning was not recorded. What follows is what happens when an institution's silence has a body count. Number 9. The Bishop of Marseille and the ships he let dock. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived at the port of Marseille. The sailors were dying when the ships docked. Those who were not dead had black swellings at their armpits and groins the size of eggs. The port authorities ordered the ships back out to sea. Most accounts of the Black Death's arrival in Western Europe begin here, with the ships turned away. The accounts do not ask what the port authorities knew before the ships arrived. Klaus Bergdolt, in The Black Death, published by Polity Press in 2003, examined the correspondence of the Bishop of Marseille in the weeks before the ships arrived. Genoese merchants had been writing to their trading partners in southern French ports since September. The letters described what was happening in Messina, in Catania, in the Sicilian ports where the ships had last called. The descriptions were specific. The deaths were fast. The swellings were distinctive. The letters arrived before the ships did. The Bishop of Marseille received correspondence during this period. Bergdolt identifies surviving letters that place awareness of the Sicilian outbreak in southern French ecclesiastical circles before the October arrival. The specific letter to the bishop has not been confirmed as surviving. Bergdolt's attribution rests on correspondence networks that are level 2 evidence, strongly supported, not definitively proven. What is confirmed is that the ecclesiastical administration of Marseille had access to the same merchant communication networks that were carrying news of the Sicilian outbreak west. What is also confirmed is that no quarantine order was issued. No record survives of any diocesan response to the Sicilian reports before the ships arrived. The ships were turned away from Marseille. By then it was too late. The sick had already come ashore. The bishop's silence in the weeks before is not documented. It is inferred from what the documentation does not contain. Medieval archives are most dangerous not when they record what happened, but when they fail to record what was known. Number 10. Why the Black Death stopped and what the counts got wrong. This is the largest undocumented mortality event in European history. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1346 and 1353. Every number in that range is an estimate. The primary sources for those estimates are the same institutional records, parish registers, tax rolls, census counts that this video has spent the last 20 minutes showing you cannot be trusted. Ole Benedictau at the University of Oslo spent decades compiling regional mortality estimates in the Black Death 1346 to 1353, published by Boydell Press in 2004. His figure is 60%. Most historians consider this the high end. The mainstream range sits between 30 and 50%. The gap between 30 and 60% represents tens of millions of human beings. Sharon DeWitte at the University of South Carolina approached the question from a different direction. Her skeletal analysis of pre-plague and post-plague cemetery populations in London, published in PLOS One in 2014, found that the post-plague population was measurably healthier than the pre-plague population. Bone density, childhood illness markers, evidence of healed infections, all improved in the post-plague cohort. The survivors were not a random sample of the pre-plague population. They were the robust end of it. The plague had selected for the healthy and killed the rest. DeWitte's finding complicates the institutional mortality counts in a specific way. Parish burial registers counted household members. They counted property holders, guild members, and their families. They were instruments of property and obligation, not instruments of demography. The people least likely to appear in those records, the landless, the vagrant, the chronically ill, the very old, were precisely the people the plague killed first and hardest. The institutional record was not designed to count them. It didn't. The question of why the Black Death's recurrences diminished after 1353 remains genuinely unresolved. Acquired immunity, rodent population dynamics, and strain attenuation are all proposed. None has been confirmed as the primary mechanism. What DeWitte's work establishes is that the population that survived was biologically different from the one that preceded it. The disease shaped the people who recorded its end. Those people used the same institutional apparatus that had been managing plague mortality all along. Every number this history gave you was produced by an institution with a reason to manage it. The true count is not lost. It was never made. The church recorded what the church could afford to acknowledge. The crown recorded what the crown could afford to survive. The dead filled the gap between those two numbers and left no document behind. What John of Ephesus understood in Constantinople in 542 is what Sharon DeWitte confirmed in a London cemetery in 2014. The institution and the body count have never been the same thing. They never were.